Hello everybody, my name's Andrew Berry and welcome to At the Benches YouTube channel, and also welcome to an hour's worth of question and answers. A little bit of a different background. We are sort of decorating the studio here and doing lots of work, so it's a bit of a boring background for the time being. So we got a few questions to start off with. That's come into the chat already. Somebody was asking about sponsors mark. That's with the assay offices here in the UK. No, you don't have to be referred. You can just simply go and apply for a sponsor's mark. Everything's online these days. You've got the Birmingham assay, London assay, Sheffield and Edinburgh, whichever you're nearest to. Just go online, check them out, and you can download all the forms to fill in the required sponsorship forms. It's not necessarily being sponsored. It's just purely to have your initials within a certain outline. But go on to the assay offices of Great Britain and check out all the information that they have for you. Louise, anything coming in that we can have a chat about?
Yes, Carrie's asking, I'd like to know, when filing, is it okay to file in both directions, back and forth, or does the backward motion pull towards you clog the file?
Okay, so ideally a file will only file and be effective going forward because the teeth are aiming in that direction. Really, once you get to the end of the travel, you should lift the file up, bring it back, put it back down and file forwards again. So you're always doing that sort of motion. Some people say it damages the file if you keep going back and forth because you're rubbing the metal against the file on the backward stroke, and the backward stroke doesn't do anything at all. But it's good practice to try and get into the habit of going forwards, lifting off, back, forwards, almost like perhaps say when you're rowing, you row down, don't you? You put the oars down, you lift the oar back up and it goes back in again. So always try and make sure you file on a forward and lift and forward and lift. I hope that answers your question.
Okay, question from Juliet. I'm considering buying a hammer handpiece. I'd like to know how to modify the points by hand. I don't have a grinder. Also, what are the modifications for the points?
All right then, so yeah, a hammer handpiece will go on your flex shaft. I don't have one here, it's downstairs in the other workshop, but the little anvils on the front, you can buy packs of them. They're of a soft metal, they're not hardened in any way, so you can just file them with an old file to get the correct shape on it. Correct shape depends on what you're doing. A nice flat, so like a flat end would be ideal if you were just sort of tapping around on a bezel, but make sure that the edges of that flat face are slightly rounded so they don't damage the actual bezel itself, or just have it slightly rounded on the end so you're gently pushing the metal. You can adapt these little tips, as I said, with the file, buff them, polish them, then you can twist them into the handpiece, and that should be sufficient enough. And you can pick up the anvils really, really cheap. As I said, they come in about a packs of 4. Shape them whichever way you want to. There is no right or wrong way. It's just really whatever suits you, really. But sort of just a nice flat punch like that, rounded edges or just slightly rounded. Make sure it's polished. You can polish it with a little pendant motor or on a Dremel, and that's all you really need. But yeah, they're really, really good. There's an adjustment to adjust the amount of pressure it gives out, and always run it at a very low speed. I think they recommend about 6,000. Very hard to gauge these things, but on a quite a thump, 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 thump sort of speed, as opposed to brrr, because brrr really does nothing. And make sure that your piece that you're holding on to is rock solid, so you could actually put it, if you're doing a bezel, put it onto a mandrel, so when the little reciprocating head hits it, the ring doesn't move. It's nice and solid. But something like that would be absolutely ideal. Hope that answers your question. How, Louise, anything else?
Lots more, yes. What tool do you use? This is from Mark. What tool do you use to split shade claws? Do you make one or just use a graver? Oh, right. I've got one downstairs, but all it is you can use a graver, but make sure that the tip comes at an angle this way, so when you push down on top of the claw, it splits the claw evenly. If you have an engraver with a face that is, how can I work this, just like this, have it like this, and you push down, this side here is going to push the claw further over this way than on this side.
So I would modify a graver if you've got, or a little pusher, a little steel pusher. Make sure you get a nice edge, sharpish, sort of like 45-degree edge like that. So when you come then to push down onto the claw, it separates it nice and evenly. Don't bother buying one, just make one yourself from perhaps an old graver, or even you could even get one of your old burrs that completely wears out. I know it's rounded, but just file a nice peak on the end that way, and that would do the job just as good. Louise, anything else?
Yes, Sebastian is asking, what is your opinion on sand casting? How well does it work, and would you recommend trying it out while thinking about the value of the product compared to the price?
Sand casting, yep. Sand casting is always great. The most popular one is Delft clay casting. Yeah, I'd always get a. You could buy the kit. It comes with the rings and comes with the sand. You saying, is it economical, or is it? Sorry.
Would you recommend trying it out while thinking about the value of the product compared to the price?
Yeah, I would always experiment with it. There are limitations when it comes to sand casting. You can't have any underhangs, because when you then try and remove the mold, the master out of the mold, it'll damage the mold where it's got the underhangs. Yeah. So whatever you push in, you got to bring straight out. As the value, I'm not really quite sure the question, but it's absolutely brilliant because you can cast it at your own bench here. As long as you've got a decent torch to melt the metal, to pour into the actual sand itself, yeah, give it a go. I think the kits aren't that expensive.
I think you mean, is it worth the money? Basically,
is it worth the money? Yeah, absolutely. It definitely is worth the money, because the sand gets burned that's in contact with the metal, but you just scrape that off, throw that away, and you can reuse the rest of the sand. So I think it's bags of 2 kilograms of sand, and that will last you several years, because you hardly ever lose anything. It's just the burnt bits that you scrape off. So even though you may have a largish mold, you don't lose all that sand, you just lose a little bit, and you can reuse the sand. Always make sure you chop it up. Absolutely invaluable. It enables you to make little bits and pieces yourself, little masters that then you can go on to elaborate and do some extra work with it. And in fact, it's something that Louise was sort of toying with the idea of a little project, and we made up a wax and we toyed with the idea, didn't we, of sort of putting together the wax into the mold itself, but there were some underhangs which meant that we couldn't do it, so we're actually having to lost wax cast it, but that's another ball game altogether. But yes, definitely get a set of rings. You can get rings with a hole in on the side that enables you to have the mold on its side for the rings end to be upright and the metal to go in. That's far better than making the hole in the top of the sand. I don't have any rings up here, the downstairs, but perhaps if you have a bit of a lull in the next half hour, perhaps I'll run downstairs and get some rings and we can have a look at that.
We've got a couple of questions about torches.
Yep.
What is the best small torch? I see several on your bench. And also Emily is asking, I have a handheld torch, but need to buy something more professional. What torch / oxygen setup, etc. should I buy?
Oh, wow. Okay, yeah. So on my bench here, this is purely in this studio here. I have one of these little sort of creme brulee torches that we call them. They're about 25, 30 pounds. What's that? $40, $50. Really small, ideal for small scale work. Slightly larger scale, but I've got this one here. This is from a company called Systotech here in the UK. It's a bit larger. Don't forget the gas is held within the handle here. So depending on the size of the torch will depend on how long each one lasts with each tank full of gas. These take butane. It's not a high, what's I'm trying to say? A high temperature gas. It's quite a low temperature gas. If you want to go on to something a little bit more professional, bear with me a second. I shall run into the other studio 1 second. Okay, so here is a torch system that everybody, I say everybody, but a lot of people use. It's this one here. It's a Sievert torch. This one is a pencil nozzle. Let me just bring this other camera around We can have a quick close-up on this a minute. Here you go. So yeah, so this is the civet torch handle, pencil nozzle here. These nozzles can be replaced with a larger burner and a bigger neck. It comes with one tube, which means then you can connect that up to a tank of propane, which is a higher temperature flame. These are brilliant. If you're progressing from these little torches, this would be the next setup. Cheapest torch in the UK is to go to Hamilton Gas. They're in Ireland. You can buy the valve that goes on the tank, the hose, the handle, and the nozzle, I think for about £80, which knocks the socks off jewelry suppliers, something like Cookson's, I'm afraid. Absolutely brilliant. I would definitely recommend one of these as the next step up. If you're getting a lot more serious about your jewelry making, and you can have oxygen bottles within your premises, within, yes, a Smith's little torch is absolutely brilliant. I've got two of them downstairs. Jason and I use them. You've got propane and oxygen coming into the torch. The temperature of that torch is a lot more fierce. It's a lot hotter because you've got the oxygen that you can introduce into the flame. So start off with these. Excellent little torches. But if you want to start melting down decent amounts, especially if you're doing your sand casting, get the sieverts because you can get different nozzles and interchangeable nozzles. If you're doing, say, platinum work, something like that, or you need a lot of heat, the little Smith's little torches are absolutely brilliant. But they do, the torch itself is very cheap, but the expensive parts are the flashback arresters and the valves. They are about 3 or 4 times the cost of the little torch. So you may think the torch is cheap, but it's the valves and the flashback arresters that do add to the cost, and also the rental on the oxygen tank as well. I think that's £120 a year in the UK, plus then you've got to have it refilled. Hope that helps.
Next question.
Yep.
Have you ever worked with titanium? And if so, do you have any recommendations?
Titanium, no, I haven't really worked with it an awful lot. Back in my student days, we experimented with the coloration, passing electrical current through to get all those gorgeous, vibrant colors along the piece. It was really, really popular back in the mid to late 80s. You can saw it with a piercing saw, you can shear it, but that's as far as I've gone. I haven't tried to do anything else with it. I haven't tried to weld it. I have no idea how you would weld it. You can bend it, you can shape it, but apart from that, I really don't have any experience at all, apart from making the little titanium clamps from New Concepts. So I can't really help you an awful lot on, unfortunately, but I know titanium is a very hard metal to work with, especially if I think you want to try and join it. I'm not even sure how, but yeah, it's very technical, a bit beyond my my scope, I'm afraid. Louise, anything else?
Yeah, we've got one
lots
from
of
Diane.
questions.
Yeah, she's having difficulty making a bezel setting with a stone. That is because she hit on both sides. Are there any videos on at the bench which can help if someone pointing in the direction of?
So you've got a double bezel. I'd like a, so it's not flat backed, so it's slightly just domed on the top and it's domed on the bottom, but you want to bezel set it. The best way of doing that is to do something what the Navajo Indians used to do with their turquoise, is get the bezel, put a little layer of sawdust in the bottom of the bezel, providing it is completely enclosed, and then you can set your stone into that sawdust, so the sawdust then cushions it, and then you can put the bezel around it, and that should help settle the stone within the bezel itself. If the bezel is an open back, then you really shouldn't have too much trouble, because the edge of the stone would locate on the bearing on the bezel itself, or even rest upon the bottom plate with a little hole in the bottom for the belly of the stone to stick below.
Okay,
Oh, but by the way, if I'm not really answering your question completely, just come back up on the chat and just say, Andrew, you didn't do this, that, and the other, or I need a bit more explanation, and I'm happy to do that. Sorry, Louise.
Sorry, okay. Question from the Vintage Bargeman. Will melting down scrap silver cause fire scale to appear on your rolled down ingot? Sorry, John, that's your name.
I think I read an article just the other day that molten silver will absorb 3 times its volume in oxygen. So if you have a torch that is very, very an oxidizing torch that is really hissing, that you have a lot of oxygen being forced through the flame, the silver will absorb that oxygen. This is the reason why these torches are pretty good, because you just have to have this flame and nothing else. You can't add any more oxygen to it. So when you come to melt silver down, don't have a really strong, hissy, oxidizing flame, because the silver will absorb the oxygen. And I wouldn't really melt silver many times because of the problem that because yes, if there's oxygen going into the silver, the oxygen will oxidize with the copper. So don't be in a rush really to melt your silver. The silver is going to absorb it. Will you get fire scale and fire stain when you roll it? I think if you do have that sort of flame, yes, yes, you would. But also when you come to melt your silver down in your bit of crucible, don't forget to put some borax. Get some powdered borax, or just get your cone and go and squidge the end of the cone. That's why this cone is a bit, as you can see, it's a bit melted and flat on the end, because basically we just use that to squidge down on top of the molten silver. And if there's a layer of borax or flux over that molten silver, it will protect the silver from absorbing too much heat. So just take care when you do it, but don't melt the silver down too many times.
Are you talking about your borax?
My borax cone,
yeah. Somebody asked, can you make your own borax?
You can get, I'm not quite sure whether you can actually make the cones like this, but you can get borax powder, and I'm sure you can get in the US borax powder. I can't remember the brand or the make, but yes, you can get a little bit of powdered borax. You can put it in a little dish, mix it up with a little bit of water. What you still may need to do, if it's still slightly granular, you still may need a little dish and perhaps like a pestle and mortar to grind it, to make it into a bit more of a powder, because I think if it's granular, it's not going to get that lovely, smooth, creamy consistency that you get if you actually used a borax dish like that. But yes, you can make it, but you won't be able to make your own cones. Yep.
May has got in touch from Kingsclear. Hi Andrew, love your work. Please can you talk about how to get rid of stamp marks from the other side of the silver you have stamped?
The best way is to try and make sure that those marks don't appear on the other side. If you're stamping out, say putting a stamp on the inside of a ring shank and the outside of the ring shank is rounded, always try and get something that matches the same profile of what you're actually stamping. So you could get a piece of wood, get a burr, make a bit of a groove in the wood, put the ring into it so the profile of the ring matches the shape of the groove in your wood, and then you can hammer, and then you shouldn't get anything coming through to the other side. Likewise, if you've got a nice flat piece of metal, nice flat piece of metal then to hammer onto, and in theory you shouldn't get anything going through. Don't stamp too hard, and if it does come through, your best way is to get something like a buff stick, just to buff the back of it, just to sort of take it down a little bit and try and blend in the contours. Some people will use, I haven't got one here, like a swage block, or also what is quite handy is to have, say, a doming, bear with me, a doming punch, but doming block. Oh, the place is in an absolute mess. Or have something like a doming block here, and that then you would find a particular hole that matches the diameter of the ring. So you can put the ring into here, and then you would punch through onto or inside the ring shank itself, and it shouldn't disfigure because of the shape of the dome on the outside. And I think that would be the best way to stop it. But if you've got it, bus stick just to bring the contour of the metal back in to match the rest of it. Yep, another one.
George is asking, when applying boric acid to prevent fire scale while soldering, how do you prevent the solder from flowing everywhere, or is it meant to be used while you're annealing?
Yeah, I think you left a message on the fire scale video. When you come to heat up the metal to solder, the temperature is a lot hotter than what you actually need for just gently annealing. As you work through a piece, the constant warming up and the quenching sort of anneals the piece every single time. So you wouldn't necessarily have to keep annealing the piece. Just the pure action of soldering everything onto the piece will just anneal it all in one piece itself. But if you do, because annealing is at a lot lower temperature, the solder should be nowhere near melting when you anneal, if you wanted to anneal that way. If you are unsure, I would get some yellow ochre paint. I would get some whiteout. What's it, whiteout in the US? You think it's whiteout, isn't it? Snowpake, Tipex. You know what Tipex is, don't you? I think it's whiteout. You would use that. You'd paint that over your solder joint. That would then protect it and stop the solder from running. And then you can put your flux over the whole piece. The flux then would protect the whole piece from the fire scale, and then the whiteout, the yellow ochre, or some powdered rouge would stop the solder from running. But the solder should get to nowhere near the right temperature for it to melt if you're just gently annealing the piece. Hope that helps. But good question.
Can you melt silver or gold filings at home for reuse? If so, what procedure would you use so the filings don't blow around?
Okay, so I would not really want to reuse the filings, like the lemon that you get in the bottom of your tray. Here's one I prepared earlier, and you can see this is in the bottom of my tray. Yes, I should sort all this out, and perhaps I should have done some wax carving when I had some lemon in the bottom, but I wouldn't recommend it because you're going to get little bits of metal in it. You're going to get metal from the file. Some of the file may be coming off. You're going to get some impurities in it. Sure, you can get a magnet and go over the filings with a magnet to get rid of all the bits of metal in it. I really still wouldn't recommend it. I think what you can also do is wrap it up within some tissue paper if you want to try it. Tissue paper or some paper in a little bundle, and then soak that then with some borax so it all becomes moistened, yeah. I haven't promised my words today. So it's all moistened, and when you put the flame on it then, or the borax should cover the filings and stop the filings blowing away. Or if you've got a kiln, you can put the filings in a little crucible and put that into the kiln and bring the kiln up to temperature to melt the filings. But I think there are going to be so many impurities in your filings. For instance, the wax. When you use wax on the saw blades, it's not something that I would recommend. I know some people do it, and if you do it, and say you've got 9 carat and you want to experiment and melt it down and you're going to be selling your pieces, I would always add some extra gold of a higher carat or a higher finesse just to counteract any impurities that may lower the quality of that 9 carat. So you bring it up above the 9 carat quality when you go and send it off to be hallmarked. So yeah, in a little tight little bundle of paper, bundle of tissue paper, soak it in borax, and then hopefully that then would hold it all together should you want to try and melt them down. But another little thing that you can do is that you can experiment with these filings on a silver surface or a gold surface. You could put some borax across a piece of silver, get some nice coarse gold filings and sprinkle the gold filings onto the borax, onto the silver, and then heat it up so the surface just starts to melt of the silver, and that will fuse then with the gold. And then if you decide to oxidize the silver, that'll look absolutely stunning. And I think I've got some ideas in my head for a little film. I'm sure we've done that actually already on At the Bench already. I'm sure we have. But yeah, that's another good question. Thank you.
Jade is asking, which is the best supplier for metal wire?
Okay, so here in the UK, I think the majority of places now have closed down. I know John Black of, I think it's Blacksmith Arts. You can find him on Facebook. Search for John Black. I'm sure it's Blacksmith Arts. He is still sending out bullion. He's still sending out wire at the moment. I don't know about the rest of the world. I'm sure some of the big companies like Rio Grande or Stuller are actually still, or Guesswine are actually still sending items out. But I can't say there is a best supplier. The best supplier is the supplier that has the right wire, the right stock in stock, and the one who can get it to you the fastest. They pretty much got to charge the same sort of price. The more you buy, the cheaper per gram it should be. So I can't really give you a definite answer to that, but go onto Facebook, search out for John Black, that's Jon Black, John Black. I'm sure it's Blacksmith Arts. Get in contact with him, and he should be able to send something out if you're in the UK. If you're in the Canada, Bully.
Bully.
Sorry, Bully.
Bully, I'll tag, should I tag it?
Yeah.
You did put something up, didn't you? And I haven't, we've got to.
Yeah, I think it was, I'm sure it's Bully,
definitely.
Bully. Yes, Bully. Please search for him. I know he's in Canada. I know he. Yeah, sure. Yeah, he's still. I think Louise has just popped that onto the chat now. He's still shipping out. Check back on the chat. He's still checking out. In fact, I'll put a copy paste. Yeah, cool. Okay, so yeah, Bully. I'm sure I say it the wrong way around. Check him out because he's still posting out as well in Canada and the US as well. Okay, all done?
Yeah. I've lost my place now.
Okay, cool.
What did I get?
I'll let the
Dawn Marie is asking, any tips on soldering patterned wire and attaching, overlaying it onto a plain silver band?
Soldering patterned wire to stop the solder flowing onto the decoration of the wire. As I said a little bit earlier, some Tipex, Snowpake, some whiteout on the part of the pattern you don't want the solder to flow. You can use things like powdered rouge, you can use things like yellow ochre paint that would inhibit and stop the solder from flowing, and that would stop the solder from going into the decoration. That would actually then be able to solder your, say, your overlay together. If you're trying to apply that on top of another ring, I think I would try and just do it flat, have the ring blank flat, and then solder on your overlay on top of that first of all, because if you have a ring made up and you've got another ring that is your overlay, that's your pattern wire, and you try and put it over the top, if they're of two different metals, they're going to expand differently. So what you may find is that perhaps the inside will expand and perhaps it'll force open the overlay, the joint of the overlay. It may have problems that way. But I would always perhaps try and do it on a nice flat block, flat piece of metal with the overlay soldered on top and sweat soldered on top. You can be, then you can bend all that around and make a ring. And then really all you got to do then is just solder once. But when you come to do that, make sure you put some binding wire around the ring itself to hold it together and also to hold that overlay that's coming over the top to make sure all those joints stay in contact with each other. Okay, good question.
Okay, Lynn is asking, can you discuss the perfect flame for use for soldering bezels? I have a Smith Little with propane and oxy concentrator, and I always wonder about what tip to use and what type of flame.
Okay, so with the Smith Little torch we got downstairs, I never change the nozzle. I think I use like a number 6, and even though sometimes that may seem too big for the job I'm doing, you can always vary the heat by bringing the torch away. Never ever have, as I said a bit earlier, an oxygen there, the brain's gone, an oxidizing flame by having too much oxygen coming through the flame. It's going to be far too hot. You're going to end up burning and melting down your bezel. So always have a slightly bushier flame, something like, let me see if I can do it on these sort of torches, actually, see if we can sort of have some sort of idea. So what I try and do is have something like, can you hear that? There's a little bit of oxygen and it's on the end here, is quite bushy. Can you see it? There we go. You can see the flame is a bit bushy on the end. You can see it's just moving around as opposed to that. That may be a little bit too harsh. Come and have a little less oxygen. So perhaps you get a little bit of yellow just appearing on the tip here. That's a bit more of a neutral flame. You can just see a bit of yellow coming here. I would then use that, but then let me just grab something I put, so I don't want to put my finger in the flame. So then I would use the tip by here for soldering the bezel, because this is gently going to warm up the whole area. Have anything that's too harsh like this, it's going to heat up too quick and you're going to melt. You can always bring the torch away, so you're using the end of the flame by here, but a little bit of a softer flame like this would be nice. Gently does it, and then you shouldn't end up melting the bezel. A Smith's little torch is absolutely brilliant, but you do have to be careful with it, because it'll absolutely obliterate your work if you get the flame far too hot. Have too small a flame, have too small a nozzle on it, and it's not going to be a big enough flame to warm up the whole area. But I always use like a number 6. I'm sure it's number 6 stays on. It's been on there since day one. But you vary the amount of heat by the amount of gas and the amount of oxygen, and also the position of the flame as well on the piece. So that would be your best bet. A slightly a neutral flame, a bit of yellow on the end, not too hot, gently over the whole piece. Heat up the main part of the piece first and then the bezel afterwards, and that should be fantastic. Yes, please.
Sandy is asking, is there an easier way to burnish? I have arthritis in my thumb and can't seem to do it well.
Yeah, you've really got to put down a lot of strength. The other way to do it would be, let me see what I've got on my bench here that I could just sort of experiment with. Okay, so I'm going to pretend that, now that this mop is my ring or a piece of metal that I want to burnish. And I'm going to get my burnisher, which I'm going to pretend is this. So this is going to be my burnisher. This close-up camera is not too good by here. There we go. So then what I would do, because say this thumb is a bit poorly and haven't got a lot of strength, I would then incorporate these fingers over here. So what I would do, because when you come to burnish, you really got to sort of like use your thumb to burnish and burnish the metal down. But if you can use these fingers and pull these fingers down and pull the burnisher onto the metal. Does that make sense here? If we can do it this way. There we go. So I would use these fingers of this hand, that perhaps it is my good hand, to sort of grab onto this hand and to pull. So it's these fingers here that are pulling the burnisher, and this thumb is perhaps my not a very good thumb and not a lot of strength. So you don't really have to use that at all. You just use these fingers to pull that back and forth. Not very good on this close-up camera, is it? Here we go. And you'd use these fingers to pull the burnisher down onto the metal. Does that make sense? Yeah. And then you can pull this down. So you don't have to use this thumb at all. And also if it's this thumb that's a bit not too good, well then it doesn't matter too much because you still got this thumb. Yeah, I hope that helps. But yeah, you don't have to use the thumb, use the fingers of the other hand to pull the burnisher down onto the metal whilst you're burnishing. It does take a lot of practice, I must admit. I'm not a great fan of burnishing, but yeah, it is a very, very good technique. But make sure your burnisher is absolutely gorgeously highly polished, because don't forget any marks that's in that burnisher will actually impart a mark upon the metal that you're burnishing. So make sure it's really, really highly polished. How are we doing?
Andreas is asking, how can I use Delft clay with an object like a cylinder with texture outside and inside?
You can't. You can't have a texture on the outside. It has to be a plain, almost like a cylinder, because if you have texture on the outside, again, to say this is the cylinder that we're looking at, and you have texture, on the sides, and say there's a groove. Let me just come this close up camera again. Here we go. So say now we've got this, we're going to put this into our Delft clay, and the texture is this groove, say on either side. When you push that into the Delft clay may go into the groove, but then when you pull this back out, it's going to pull out the bit of clay that goes inside the texture, so you're not going to be able to do it. The only way you're going to do it is if you actually had a texture on the bottom here or the top. That would work because that goes straight down into the sand. If you have a texture on the sides, it's not going to work because the sand is going to want to come around and fill that texture, and then as you lift out your master, then it's going to break the sand and you're going to ruin the detail that you've put on it. So it'll only work on the bottoms, and it definitely won't work on the inside. If you turned it up this way as a cylinder, there's no chance that is going to work either, I'm afraid. So Delft clay would not be the casting choice for that. If you're going to do that, you'd have to do some lost wax casting, and you could send off the master to a lost wax casting company and get them to cast that for you if you need that particular texture.
Cotton Candies is asking about making a signet ring. How to make real sharp edges around the middle flat surface. Filing doesn't work.
And you could cast it in Delft clay. that would be the ideal medium for casting a signet ring. Just get a signet ring, get your Delft clay, and then squash it down. Yep, that way, and Delft clay cast it, and then you're going to get an exact replica of what you put into it. If you're trying to make it from a piece of flat sheet, it does have to be quite thick where the head is, because you have to allow for the circumference on the underside, because the signet ring then should be flat on the top. So your bit of metal here and here is really going to be quite thick. I don't think you're going to get an absolute sharp, crisp top edge to a signet ring if you're going to make it from some flat sheet. It does really have to be cast, I'm afraid. I'm afraid it does. Or buy a stamping, and they're already stamped out with nice sharp edges. And again, you can buy stampings from a lot of the jewel suppliers as well. Yes, please.
Iona is asking, would I be able to make myself sheet and wire with a Durston C80 mini rolling mill?
Combination, yes you can, because you've got enough area. You won't be able to make very thick wire because you're limited to the amount of V grooves that you've got. I think you couldn't put anything more than about 5mm sort of square ingot through it. But yeah, something like that. That's a combination mill, so you should have a little bit of a flat, and you should have some of the V grooves on the other side. Yeah, you should be able to do that. I think, is the C80 a direct drive mill? I think it is. So a little bit of, yeah, power on the elbow and the shoulder to try and get it through. So if you can cast a little ingot in silver, you should be able to pass it through the V grooves, go through it, anneal it, next one down, and keep annealing it every few passes through the V grooves, and you should be able to get some nice square wire. Was it round wire as well? Yes, what wire? And if you want round wire, you can pull that through a draw plate, but in a sheet as well, melt it down into a little ingot, and you can pass that through. I think the maximum thickness is about 5mm again. So if your ingot was a little bit too deep, you can always hammer it flatter so you can put it through the flat rolls. But I think that's a direct drive, so it is going to take a little bit more power than what it would do is if you had a gearbox on the outside. But yeah, perfectly fine. You have no problems with that.
Okay, Hazel's next. I want to get a good join on a double twist bangle using 5mm D-shaped silver wire. What's your recommendation on how you would set that up for a perfect solder join?
Was it a bangle?
Bangle, yeah.
Bangle.
Double twist bangle.
Okay, so what I would do is you should have like a bangle length chart. So everybody's hands are slightly different. I think the average size is 20.5 centimeters slip over bangle, an average. So your length of metal should be 20.5. What I would do is make up the twists. if you're going to flatten it in a rolling mill, flatten it and then keep measuring it and make sure that where perhaps the metal comes across and crosses like this, you measure along from that side all the way to the other 20.5 centimeters, and you make sure that the pattern matches over this side where it comes across and crosses. So then when you cut through those ends, that takes the correct length of the bangle. When you bend it around, obviously then you've cut it in the right length. If you're just twisting it and leaving it twisted, I would again do exactly the same thing. I twist it and then measure out from where the metal again crosses like this, measure 20.5 and make sure that 20.5 comes exactly the same spot where the metal gets crossed over like this. If it doesn't, twist it a little bit more, measure again, but make sure that where the pattern sort of matches on either end is the correct length that you're going to need. And so the average is 20.5 centimeters, which is 62.5 millimeters inside diameter. Okay, hope that helps.
Okay, Stephen is asking, I have seen bracelets with texture background. How is this created?
Texture backgrounds. A lot of bracelets, bangles, bracelets and bangles, they're usually rolled out with a texture on the top roll. So as you take it through, take like a rolling mill, the bottom is plain, the top has a repeated pattern on the top roll, and then that then gets imparted onto the silver itself, and then you get obviously the positive from the negative roller that you pass it through. That is the way you would get a very simple, something like the expanding baby bangles, for instance. That's exactly how that is made. You can also get some wire dies from, I can't remember, you can get them from India, but you should be able to get them from this country. And then you hammer the wire into the dies, and the dies have a pattern, so a repeated pattern, so you can get the background that way. Or the other way you could do it is to etch the background. You could etch it with some nitric acid or some, using silver, nitric acid is better. And then you'd use a lacquer upon the top, and you'd scrape off the lacquer where you want the acid to attack, and you get a background that way. Or you could actually get the background that would be hand engraved. And that would be another way. But the easiest way of doing it is to get some patterned rollers to go on a rolling mill on the extension rollers on the outside of a mill, and that then could put a gorgeous pattern and you get a fantastic background. I think that's what you mean. If it isn't, just pop it back in the chat and explain a bit more, and hopefully I'll be able to explain for you.
Okay, Bruno is asking, when you're making a halo ring, do you drill to solder the claws? Can you explain with the drawing, please?
Let's have a look. Do I drill? I would. A halo, yes. I think if you have, let me turn on to this here now. Turn it onto there. Okay, so I think if you have, let me just quickly draw this out for you. So that's the inside, that's the outside, and this would be this coming around here, and we'd have your holes around here. Does that make sense now? Or your holes would be around here. This is like a disc. Like this here, your ring shank would be coming around this way. Underneath, Patrick, a nice bit of a split shank coming around like this. Like this, coming around. Okay, so this is your shank coming around. These are the splits coming around here. This is your disc that in theory is your halo, and we want to put a stone up here. You can get a cylinder burr and put a little bit of a mark in there. You have a little bit of a mark in there. I have a 6-claw, just a bit of a U shape coming around like this, coming around like that there. I don't know how many I've done. I'm sure I've done more than that. And this is the inside then, and you'd have that sort of, does that make sense? Like that, coming around. Yeah, and then you'd have these little areas here where then, yes, you would then put your claw coming up out of those. This is the simplest way of doing it. Really terrible drawing, Andrew. Wouldn't believe I got a degree in design, would you? Yeah, so then your little claws then would go into those little areas where you've used your cylinder burr. Cylinder burr would be the same diameter as the wire, and then the claws have got something to go into. I wouldn't necessarily drill into the plate, because then you drill in too far into the plate itself, whereas the diamonds should be all nicely set around the plate this way. So these little semicircles should fit in nicely in between where the stones come to. Not enough room to drill a complete hole. Hope that makes sense. Don't judge me by my drawing, will you? But that's the simplest way that I think you could actually do it. Okay, and this should be another claw there. And this is your lovely diamond on the top here. There we go. Okay, cool.
Okay, Mary is asking, trying to sweat a silver piece to copper about 1.5 inches. Is that 1.25?
Yeah, yeah.
Any tips? I've tried 3 times and can't get solder to melt the two together using mini and large butane torches.
You really have to make sure that, thank you. You have to make sure that your surfaces are absolutely clean and tidy. There must be no oxides, no grease or anything like that. Warm it up, just dunk it in the acid to get it nice and clean. Make sure that your solder joints, the joints that you're trying to come along, are absolutely perfect as well. Make sure they are nice, close fitting. Cover the area with borax so you don't get any oxides from the torch. Now, it is very awkward soldering, say, was it a silver bezel to copper?
Silver piece of copper,
yeah. It is. It's not something that I do that often, but you do have to heat up the copper to a reasonable temperature before the actual solder is going to start to melt. And again, copper is a little bugger when it comes to having oxides on it. If there's no flux or a little bit of flux that isn't covering the surface, the copper will oxidize and the solder will not flow. So you've got to make sure that that joint is absolutely perfect, close fitting. Smother it with a flux, whatever your choice of flux is, whether it be borax or flux or whatever it may be. But make sure that the copper gets up to a good temperature really before you start putting the heat on the bezel, because the heat that comes off the copper should be enough to go onto the bezel. Put the solder on the inside of the bezel, so when the solder flows, it'll flow out, as opposed to putting it on the outside and you get a bit of a dirty join. But put the solder on the inside of the bezel. When that copper is the correct temperature, that solder then will flow, and as it flows out, the bezel is by here, and then the solder should go into the bezel at the bottom of the bezel where the join is. But yeah, depending on the size, this isn't going to do. This should be the right sort of size torch if it's a reasonable size. If it's something like a bangle, this really isn't going to be enough either, and you'd have to get your little civet torch with perhaps a larger nozzle on it. But it's all to do with heat. It's about heat. Make sure you get a nice reflective block, heat block like this that reflects the heat back and doesn't absorb it and take the heat away. Put some blocks behind your little area as well, so everything is contained and there's as much heat as possible being kept onto the piece. And I think it's just basically practice when it comes to soldering. But I think that should do it. But it's important that copper has to be the right heat before that solder is going to melt, and make sure it's nice and clean. Yes, Louise?
Okay, I'm having difficulty creating tap and dies in silver consistently. Some will work perfect and others will bend, split, break, tap, etc. Any help would be amazing.
Do you mean the taps? Perhaps the taps would be breaking, perhaps in the holes. When it comes to things like cold connections, so taps and dies are a really good way of putting two metals together, or to holding two metals together. I've done quite a few of these. I've done some nipple bars. So we've done a lot of taps. I find that you can't make the actual connection, the nut and the bolt, too tight. You can't make that joint too tight. It has to be slightly loose. So just experiment. it's really hard to try and explain without actually having a tap and die set here. I've got some little inexpensive one. It's a little plate with a number of holes in it. You'd get your silver wire, you would file a bit of a point on it, and then perhaps you put that in your vise and get the plate on top, and you'd start going forward, perhaps 2 little quarter turns, and then back a quarter, and then that torch again falling on the floor, and then forward again a little bit, and then back one, perhaps forward 2, back 1. Put lubrication on it, always important, and just go forward 2, back 1, forward 2, back 1. And that is the best way to tap your thread on wire. And then also when it comes to the hole, exactly the same thing. Lubrication on it, get your tap. No, that's tap, and that was the die. Yes, we get your tap and put it into the hole. And again, keep it upright. I would just go forward twice, back once. Lubrication, forward twice, back once, and keep on going and going and going. Always cut a thread that is actually perhaps longer than what you need. Then you can always choose the best part of your thread. And that's about it. But don't try and make that connection too tight initially, because it's never going to work. There's always going to be a little bit of play in it, but then once you come along and tighten up that connection, that is when it would really hold the 2 pieces together. But that is a good film idea. So tap and die set. Yeah, well done. Thank you. Yes, Louise. Any more? Okay, yeah, Len is asking, I find it hard to make the bezel push down on the cabochon with a hand burnisher. Do you have any tips to make it easier? Yeah, so going back to the beginning of the film, when I mentioned about a little bit of sawdust in the bottom, because what happens, metal has a bit of a memory. You may push the metal over, but it'll always want to spring back slightly. So there'll always be a little bit of a gap from where the stone is to where the metal is, because it'll never be completely flush. It'll always want to come back a little bit like that. So what I would suggest, you get some sawdust or a little bit of cardboard in the bottom of the bezel, if you can. So then when the stone goes onto it, the stone has got a bit of a slight little bit of movement. Then when you come to burnish the metal over, you burnish and the stone is being pushed down into the sawdust or the cardboard. And when that metal then has its bit of memory and just comes back a little bit, the stone will come with it. And that will hopefully then fill that little bit of a gap. So that would be your best way. Sawdust or a little bit of cardboard in the bottom, it'll just cushion that stone, push down, and then this got a bit of springiness for that stone to come back up, that hopefully then will close that gap nice and tight. But don't forget, don't have too much metal sticking above your stone, otherwise you're never going to get it over the bezel, the stone itself. Just take it a little bit over so you've only got a little bit of metal to burnish over. So you're looking now, yeah, go on.
Lots of soldering questions, so I'm going to fire through to you, and hopefully they can overlap. Okay. So we're running out of time now.
Okay.
We've got how do you solder textured silver, stopping the solder flow onto the pattern, and if it does flow onto it, what can you try to remove it without damaging the texture? And somebody new to soldering is asking, I get so much solder overflowing on the piece, how do I clean up the extra solder I don't want? And what was the other solder? How do you maintain a mirror finish polish during soldering?
Okay, so going back to the first question, how to stop the solder flowing onto the design. As I mentioned earlier, Tipex, whiteout, yellow ochre paint, powdered rouge, paint that on the part of the design you don't want the solder to flow onto. That will inhibit and stop the solder flowing. I think sure I've done a YouTube film on that, how to stop solder from flowing. There's lots of other methods out there. You can buy some commercially available paint that you would put on the pattern with it you want to keep, and the rest of it then will be nice and clean. The solder will not flow into the engraved area or the patterned area. What happens if the solder flows into it? You're stuck really. You really don't want to use an awful lot of solder. What I'd advise you to do is when you buy your solder and you have it in the strips like this, it tends to be quite thick on the ends. If you've got a rolling mill, pass it through the rolling mill, make it nice and thin, or hammer it with a ball peen hammer on the end to make it nice and thin. Then when you cut your little snippets, You can be quite generous with the overall size, but it's very, very thin. So use the most minimum amount of solder that you possibly can on the joint, and then it shouldn't then overflow into the pattern. But if it has overflowed into the pattern, you may be able to use something like a bristle brush, like a white nylon brush. I absolutely love these. Excuse the monitor on the floor by there. I said the place is a mess. A little brush like this that would get into all the little areas where the solder has flowed. That would be your best bet, or perhaps something like a 3M wheel, Scotch-Brite wheel, that perhaps would remove a little bit of solder. But once it's there, you're never going to get rid of it. Just prevent it with the stop out or the yellow ochre and the most minimum amount of solder. And what was the third part?
Maintaining the polish.
Maintain the polish. You can't. If you do highly polish it and you solder and you put it in the acid will strip out that very, very thin layer, especially if you're using silver. It'll strip out that thin layer, and then you're left with a gorgeous white finish. Then you can just repolish it gently with a bit of rouge, or even just go over it with a nice soft cloth, perhaps impregnated with rouge, just to bring that polish back. But that would be the only way. You're never going to keep that polish on the piece all the time. Once you've polished it, put it in the acid. The polish in theory is still there, the high finish is still there, but it's under that layer of fine silver that the acid strips out the copper from. But you can get that back by just having to repolish it again. Yeah, hope that answered the 3 questions. Yes.
Question about cuttlefish casting.
Yes.
Recommendations for casting goals in cuttlebone, large wedding bands. Casting cuttlebone.
Cuttlefish. Yeah.
Yeah.
Cuttlefish bone recommendations for. Yeah, you can. Yes. Yeah, you can do it. You're going to get if you get your cuttlefish, and perhaps this is something that we can do on our sort of live events like this. We used to do these a few years ago. Cuttlefish. So we'll do cuttlefish casting live, and we'll do some Delft clay casting live. I think that'd be absolutely awesome. Cuttlefish bone. There's always a hard side and a soft side. Sand down that soft side so it's nice and flat. Get 2 pieces, or if you've got a large one, cut it in half so you put the 2 flats together with a hard shell is on the outside. You would get a wedding band that you want to cast, or you can make one out of wax. You would push that into the cuttlefish, perhaps push it, say, halfway into it. Or if it's a plain band, it's plain straight edged outside band, you can push it all the way into the cuttlefish. Take out the master if you're doing it that way. Now, if you want to have that gorgeous texture of the cuttlefish bone on the ring, I would then get a little bit of a paintbrush and then get rid of all the crushed cuttlefish from where that mold is, where you push the master into it, and that will reveal all that gorgeous cuttlefish texture. If you don't and want to leave it nice and plain, well, that crushed cuttlefish will provide a reasonable surface. If you have it pushed in half into this side, you push the other half on the other side, put some matchsticks around the outside, so when this half goes in and comes apart, you can always push it back together with those matchsticks locating exactly where it was, and do exactly the same thing. So you have half the mold this side, half the mold this side, cut your channel for the metal to go into it. Like everything else, if you have the Delft clay and cuttlefish, if you have too thin a mold, the metal is not going to flow from the top all the way around the bottom of the ring itself. So you've got to take a lot of care with that. Has to be quite thick, at least 2-3 millimeters, if not 4 millimeters in thickness, to allow the molten metal to get down through and around the ring if you're casting it that way. But I think that's something that we can actually do live, and that's absolutely gorgeous smell, as Louise said.
I think we've got time for one more. I'm really sorry we haven't had time, so there's just loads more questions. I'm sorry we didn't get through them all. But somebody is asking, can I use HCI acid to clean silver?
I really don't know what HCI is. Oh, hydrochloric. Yeah, hydrochloric acid. Hydrochloric acid. Hydrochloric acid. Hydrofluoric, aqua regia, clean acid, clean silver. Yeah, I'm sure. If it's hydrochloric acid, I would have thought yes, you can do. Yeah, hydrochloric acid. Well, no, oh yeah, yes, it's yeah. Okay, so it's aqua regia. Yes, you can use it to clean silver. Don't leave it in the solution for too long because it really will attack it. If you want to get your fire scale off it, I'd recommend nitric acid, 50-50 percentage, 50% water, 50% nitric, to get the oxides and the fire scale and fire stain off. And I'm sure you can do the same with, is it muric acid? Yeah. Yes, you can. Yeah. Okay, so that's it. Or one last question. One last.
Oh,
we'll have one last question. One last. Go. Yeah.
Oh my god. Okay, a non-technical question. What's the division of time you spend doing things or making things you already know, and how much do you experiment / make something new? Do you wish it was different?
Yeah, I don't have time to experiment much because at the moment I do now because we're on lockdown. But when the shop is open, I try and make every hour of every day pay. And I know that sounds really strange because you should carry on learning your art. But I do find that I do have to make every hour pay in the shop because of everybody's wages and the shop costs and everything else. I would love to have more time, and I really do think that I should make more time for myself for learning. I'd love to learn how to do some gorgeous engraving. I'd love to be able to do some lovely scroll work. I'd love to be able to get some CAD/CAM software and learn how to use that. But it's time. Time is so precious. And if I could buy time, I really, really would. And if I could clone myself into two, that would actually be brilliant because I'd have one Andrew making stuff in the shop and the other Andrew then going off around the world, learning how to do things. It sounds good, doesn't it?
What, 2 Andrews?
Yeah. You couldn't put up 2 Andrews, could you?
No.
It's bad enough just with the one Andrew. But yes, I think it is important to take time out from having to make things all the time and to practice new ideas, practice new techniques. I promised myself this year I would go to St. Petersburg in Russia to do some sort of pave setting and micro setting. But obviously that isn't going to happen now this year. But yeah, I think it is important to learn new techniques. And as Louise knows, I just don't stop. I'll go home from here now and I'll be on a high and I'll be talking about this. We want to get this studio done. We want to put a new wall across here. We want all new lights from the ceiling. Yeah, I just don't stop. But I should take time out just to chill and to learn new things. So yeah, there we go. Is that it? Is that all we got time for? Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Possible. That's very good. Okay. So thank you all very much for coming on today.
Answer the questions. I feel terrible that I couldn't read them all.
So I do apologize that we can't answer everybody's question. Again, if you probably want to try and make this a regular thing over the next few months. So again, next week we're going to do exactly the same again. If Louise is willing to ask the questions.
I'm not burning any Cuttlefish.
So what we'll do another question and answer. If I haven't answered your question this time, I do apologize, but pop on again next week and please answer. And if we don't, I do apologize. There's only so much that we can do, but I do appreciate everybody's comments today. Absolutely brilliant. But what you could do to get me prepared is that if we schedule these broadcasts for next week, you can say that you're interested, obviously, and then before we go live, perhaps ask your questions straight away at the beginning. So then we've got a bank of questions that we can answer straight away, because obviously as the questions are coming through, we're just having a hard time going through the chat and trying to find all the questions. Yep.
And also I think if it's to do with equipment, if we have them in advance, we could get the equipment to hand, so we're not wasting time running around getting it.
Yeah, brilliant idea. Yeah, so any sort of technical questions when it comes to you want me to show you something, come on perhaps 10-15 minutes before the broadcast goes live. Then we can go and get the tools and equipment here, so perhaps we can have the first 5 or 10 minutes answering those questions that we can have all the tools. It's a really good idea. You got some good ideas. Okay, so thank you all for watching. Thank you all for coming on today. Really do appreciate it. Keep looking out for the next question and answer, which will be next week. Anything else you want me to say, Louis? Anything else at all we need to talk about? Okay, brilliant. Okay, thank you all for watching. My name is Andrew Berry for At The Bench, and don't forget, down by here, atthebench.com. Check it out. It's our online jewelry training website. I'd absolutely love you to. I'm not going to say subscribe and smash that bell icon if that's something you're into, because that isn't the sort of fun we're doing today. But keep looking out on YouTube for our regular uploads, and don't forget atthebench.com. Check out, we still are producing content for that, and that's films going live every single week on there. But in the meantime, my name is Andrew Berry for At The Bench. Take care. We will see you all next week. Take care. Bye-bye.